Cardmageddon. That's what we were all expecting. And
I think we have a title for this episode, like straight out of that.
Done.
It's a strong start.
Done. Cardmageddon.
First up, we have over on which is SCA is here, but also being pushed back to March 2021. So, I mean, what's going on in this one? What do you think, Sarah? I mean, I haven't been close to this week because I've kind of been in a bit of a bunker, but what's happening?
Well, strong customer authentication officially came into force on the 14th of September. That is officially. There is, I think, an 18-month extension granted by the FCA for UK organisations to get their act together. The idea of it is it's come out of a European piece of legislation, out of PSD2, which anybody listening to this regularly knows how I feel about it or how many hours I've dedicated to reading that documentation. Long story short, it's basically going to ask for extra authentication whenever you try and make card not present payments. But I feel like Imran knows more about this than I do, perhaps.
A little bit. Cardmageddon. That's what we were all expecting. And
I think we have a title for this episode, like straight out of that.
Done.
It's a strong start.
Done. Cardmageddon. So this was the idea that because of PSD2, all, as you say, card not present, payments were going to require SCA to make them work, strong customer authentication. And frankly, industry just simply wasn't ready, even though they had more than 2, even 3 years to get ready for it. And that's partly because there are so many players in the cards activity chain. Of course, you've got the issuers, you've got the acquirers, you've got the schemes, and then you've actually got the merchants as well. And I don't think anyone could quite figure out who really was responsible for making sure that all of that stuff worked. And in the end, the government, frankly, thought they're not going to risk it. They do not want digital payments to not work here in the UK. And that is a matter of percentage points of GDP. So they said, all right, guys, we'll give you a break. And the break was across all of Europe. And I think people were surprised that it was as long as 18 months. But I think that goes to show just how important it is. Before I stop, I am going to say that I'm not an expert on this because I actually care about the other part of PSD2, which also came into force on the 14th of September, which is something called access to accounts. And that's what underpins open banking. But they're both kind of involved. In one respect, they're involved because actually one solution to SCA on cards is actually to make push payments from banks using open banking. If you followed me through all of that, well done.
I mean, we could go into access to accounts. Do you want to give us a quick overview of that, seeing as we're talking PSD2 and we have you behind the microphone? Do you want to give us a synopsis?
So here in the UK, we are delivering PSD2's access to accounts using some very cool technology. It's an API, a single API standard that 9 of the largest banks here in the UK have to implement. So as a fintech or a third party, you can access any of the UK banks using this single channel, and therefore your customers can share their bank data with you. Furthermore, if they actually want to execute payments through that channel, they can also do that. So you could instruct your favorite app, Yolt was one of the earliest ones that came into the open banking ecosystem, to make payments on your behalf. And now, in the same way that cards were given a bit of breathing space, open banking access to accounts was also given some breathing space. It was given 6 months breathing space. Now, fortunately, I look after the 9 largest banks, and by and large, they don't need it. So 95% of the UK market is here, and effectively, it's open for business. So we're very excited about that. We've got over 300 fintechs now applying to get into open banking. A small number of them are building propositions at the moment, but that's increasing exponentially. And if you look at the API volumes that are going through open banking at the moment, we're increasing about 30-40% every single month. So, it's looking promising.
It's very exciting. Keith, did you want to jump in? Because open banking, open API, strong customer authentication are kind of your bag as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, as one of the fintechs that's building to open banking, I think it's been an interesting experience for us. I recognize that it's been a really huge lift, and there are so many industry players that you do have to get aligned to make this happen. I think an interesting impact that we found from SCA is that it's not just for payments, because many banks have put it at sort of the front door. And so for just account information services, you actually now see SCA being applied every time you want to access an account. And so it's an interesting thing for some of our customers who have wanted to, say, link their account to a budgeting application, and now they have to go through this process and re-authenticate every 90 days. But I think the principle of it is something that we're all behind, which is consumer control for their data, their ability to permission it, to keep it safe. So I'm excited to see it develop. I will say that I think there was a hard to find transparency in terms of who was doing what. And it was interesting that this 18-month delay came so close to the wire, where you're waiting day in and day out and say, is this going to happen? Is this not going to happen? What country is doing what? It was a pretty interesting process to be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, the concern was the impact that all of this regulation would actually have on the average customer who really doesn't know or in fact care what open banking or SCA is or are. They just want to be able to use useful things easily and quickly. And the idea behind both of these, both open banking and SCA, is that they will enable that. But one of the biggest problems from my understanding that we've seen with the implementation of SCA is a lot of the small merchants who sell online were not prepared for this. And for them to implement it and be implemented effectively could have led to a huge loss of business and some of those small merchants going out of business. From the customer perspective, you're talking about Yolt and you were talking about using your budgeting apps. All of a sudden, you may have to, every 5 times you try and every 90 days, you try and log in, you have to put your thumbprint or enter your password or whichever extra method of authentication they've decided upon. The idea of Cardmageddon was that every 5 times you tap your contactless, you're going to have to enter your PIN, which is not a requirement. You can do that, or you can do it by volume every 100 euros or pounds, depending on where you are. So it's either or. And the idea was that this was going to be this huge problem, and everybody was going to stop making payments, and obviously that hasn't happened yet. But I think what's going to be interesting is to see the impact on both businesses and customers in the next 18 months. Because the biggest challenge has been, and I think this is partly why I've had this extension, that neither financial service institutions nor merchants can find a way to do this in such a way that is easy for customers to understand and doesn't disrupt the journeys they're used to. So if I'm used to just tapping every morning for my coffee, and then to get on the tube, and then for my lunch, and oh wait, I've done 5 transactions in a day, so the next morning I have to put my PIN in. What's that going to do to my spending behavior, to my spending patterns? The other thing that's important to note is that if you're using Google or Apple Pay, some of these restrictions don't apply. So if you're somebody who's using your watch or your phone to make contactless payments, it's not going to affect you. The third thing is the way that some of the big banks implemented it was proven flawed almost immediately. So we talked about this in a few shows ago, but Santander, their implementation of strong customer authentication for any online purchases, so using your laptop, for example, required you to have a mobile phone. So if you didn't have a mobile phone, you could not use their strong customer authentication. You could not make purchases. So
how have Apple and Google around this then?
So it's to do with the limits, which I think Keith can probably explain.
Okay.
I was just going to do a quick anecdote about this online purchase journey, because somebody in the office had the perfect, real-life example of this. She dropped her phone. The screen smashed. She went online to try and purchase a new phone with her Santander credit card.
Wait, was it a work phone? Should I be upset right now?
We don't have work phones.
Some people do.
Do they? What?
Okay, move on.
Okay, anyway, this colleague of mine went online to try and buy a new phone using her Santander credit card. Santander said, great, but you've got to authenticate that purchase using a push notification through your app. So I can't see the app because my screen's shattered. Okay, great, we'll send you an SMS. I can't see the SMS because my screen is shattered. She couldn't make the purchase. That was it. That was it. She was locked. She had to find another way. I think she actually had to physically go into a store and make the purchase for her new phone. And nobody at Santander had thought, oh, well, maybe we should have a non-mobile option. Sorry, Keith, I did interrupt you there. You were going to...
Oh, no, I was just going to give those 3 rules in case people aren't aware of what SCA is, right? You need to have 2 of the 3 of something you know, something you have, or something you are. So when you think of how Google and Apple are approaching it, they're saying, if you're paying with mobile phone and you're using Face ID or your fingerprint, that's something you have, and the face and fingerprint is something you are. And so that's how they're using it to try and basically make the smoothest flow. So I'm a little bit worried that ultimately will benefit them.
But you don't have to use your fingerprint to make contactless payments with Google Pay. So how does that work? Because I just tap my phone. I don't have to... Is it because my phone has to be locked by a pattern?
If you've unlocked your phone, then you've...
because I've unlocked it. Got it, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you've already
I've already
authenticated on the device.
No, actually, no, I can just buy Google Pay without unlocking it. I'm going to look into this now. I'm going to work this out.
Loopholes. I mean, I've seen a bunch of people who have been on Twitter saying, like, I've been SCA'd. So it's like, it's starting to become a thing, I guess, in terms of, people maybe, as you say, sort of wondering why this is happening. I mean, if you want to have a sort of a more detailed overview of this, we actually did an insights show back on episode 314. And we also took to Patrick Collinson of Stripe on episode 330, I believe it was, who had some pretty strong opinions about this one. All right.
Good. Before you move on, do you mind if I just make one very quick comment? I think it is always important that we understand why these things are happening. And of course, it is going to create more consumer inconvenience. And however, SCA really does work well on a mobile phone. The problem is when people don't have mobile phones. But the reason we're doing this is because there is a level of fraud that exists both in payments and in other areas that currently is just spread across all of society. So it's not as if it's a victimless crime. We are paying for it, and we're paying for it in higher issuing costs or higher merchant fees. And so we do need something like this to kind of, make the breakthrough, because no individual company or merchant was going to do it on their own. So I'm kind of optimistic about where it will take us. But yeah, it will take a lot of change in behavior. And it will really it will require uptake on the mobile phone, because you're right, anything on desktop, it really struggles, which is why in open banking, one of the things we did is get it onto mobile as soon as we could.
And just as a consumer, from the consumer point of view, what you're saying there is absolutely right, that you do need a mobile phone and we do all want to be safe. But it strikes me just hearing about all the notifications we're getting, and I've had them from my bank, letters, the same as everybody else has, is that we get information from our bank saying we're going to require more information from you soon. And that itself sounds to me like a little bit of a space for fraud. If anybody nefarious was listening to this, you'll say, okay, all I need to do is write to the little old lady who's using her bank and say, I'm going to need this from you. Your granny already gets calls saying, why don't you just tell me your PIN number because I need to fix your computer? Well, it does happen. I have an elderly relative it's happened to. So this is the difficult thing, and I'm sure in your industry it always is as soon as you change something, everybody gets confused. The next piece of paper they've got, they just comply with it because they think, that looks like my bank wants me to do something.
Yeah, I mean, we did I'm trying to figure out how past tense this is, but this will go out on Monday. So last Friday from the future, this is weird, a show about anti-money laundering with the ICO and the FCA, talking about exactly that, is that actually probably the most innovative people in our whole space right now is criminals. I mean, they are very well funded.
Very impressed with the ingenuity. When they stole my identity, it certainly worked. And it took me a very long time.
What happened
to me? Oh, that was years ago. That was the old sort of crime where you find a mobile phone is turning up at your house that you never ordered. Okay. And several mobile phones are turning up at your house, and people are using that as a way to authenticate their identity. That was a while ago. But the elderly relative, she was phoned up quite recently, and she has a computer, which she rarely uses, And they said, we need to fix your computer, so you better tell us your passwords. Luckily, she's not a silly elderly relative and was able to realise, I think someone told me not to do that.
I mean, that's usually about the point that my mum gives me a phone call.
Well, but the point there is we also have to be careful when we talk about, maybe not being silly or maybe having to have a mobile phone. There are a lot of vulnerable people out there who are going to be affected by this, who maybe cannot afford a mobile phone. So what are we going to do? Is the bank going to give them a mobile phone?
That'd be nice.
And what about...
Or they don't have reception.
Or they don't have
reception.
Reasons. Or what about, to your point about elderly relatives, people who are suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's who may have been told a million times, don't do that. But those people, we are starting to see products and services targeting those people to try and help them. But every time we do anything that, as you say, is trying to help the majority of the population, I think we do have to keep in mind the vulnerable section of the population and how are we going to find a way to help them. And it just, I think, requires a little bit. My argument to this is always you need a diversity within the product team who are designing the solutions, because then somebody will say, but wait, my granny had this problem, we should find a solution for that whilst we're doing it. We should make sure it's in there, rather than just assuming that everybody has a mobile phone and that's that. I know that isn't what happened. Well, it sounds like it might have happened at Santander, actually.
I mean, regulation is driving so many changes in the industry. I know a lot of our conversations around how positive it is, but actually a lot of the gaps between these things are really interesting. I mean, open banking, GDPR, like SCA, like the opportunities that sort of slide slightly between them. I mean, I'm never quite sure whether I'd love to believe that somebody's standing back from all of these things and going, this is how it all works together. But I'm not necessarily, I mean, the difference between how GDPR and from an open banking perspective are slightly at tension there. I mean, is this something you must be facing this a lot? Right?
It's a fascinating question. Well, I mean, even if you go to give you one concrete example of what you're talking about, the definition of consent under GDPR and PSD2 is marginally different. And that's pretty fundamental. So kind of what happens is, and this is where we are at the moment, is a lot of this stuff gets dreamt up in Brussels. Then we have to interpret it and implement it at a local level. And it's fine where you've got the wiggle room to do that, because by and large, particularly in the UK, we got some pretty smart people that have good overview of everything. The problem becomes is when some of that regulation is hardwired. So GDPR is actually a regulation; it doesn't get transposed. PSD2 is maximum harmonisation. So actually, that's a cut and paste into the UK legislation. So it kind of does work. It's interesting that the banks push a similar mantra, but they're less concerned about what it means for the outcome and more about how much work they have to do. So they argue for a air traffic controller to help them land all these different things at the same time. But I actually think your point is better made. We need some mechanism for actually knitting all this stuff together. And one thing I would say is that there are a lot of people in government, a lot of policy is moving from turning open banking into open finance, turning open finance into smart data, which is lots of other sectors such as energy, telco, water, and so on, and really trying to create the foundations of a digital economy. Now, that requires some very big thinking.
Yeah, it does, and I wonder how much that is being done, because I mean that would be, I mean, a lot of what we've talked about with how the regulation changes here have been such a catalyst for the ecosystem that we have today in the UK. Actually, piecing these things together in a way that fundamentally either really accelerates benefit for consumers or actually opportunities for new organisations to come to the market and create, with that competition mandate, particularly from an FCA's perspective, would allow us, I think, to continue to move forward in a way that keeps the UK at the sort of pinnacle of these things. So, I mean, it seems like probably a pretty good role for somebody, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a fascinating role. The way that I tend to think about it at the moment is that actually in all the economies across the world, we've got government departments playing different roles. So you've got regulators who are there to ensure that the legislation is enforced, but the legislators write the legislation. Then you've got antitrust. And actually that creates a really interesting triumvirate. Now, in a lot of economies, they purposefully pull those things apart to create some sort of balance. And whilst it makes a lot of sense to pull these things together, unless there's a really strong mandate to make things happen, I think you kind of get stuck as well. So great idea. I'm not sure anyone's really doing it.
Yeah, and I think that is a really hard thing to do. And I think also going back to sort of the difficulty here with implementation is because with PSD2, it's being enforced at the NCA level. If you're a multinational company or a multinational bank, you have to slightly change how you're conforming to the rules depending on where you are. And so it makes it really difficult for fintechs that want to expand. And I think it's going to be an important role to figure out how to harmonize that across Europe going forward.
Indeed. Well, I mean, this is definitely something that's going to run and run and run, so we'll come back to it definitely on a later show. All right, next up we have a...